Hi, friend. Welcome to Holly's Highlights, a podcast designed to encourage, inspire, and equip you to intentionally live your life full of purpose. I'm your host, Holly Kirby, motivational speaker, leadership cultivator, marketing strategist, and personal cheerleader. Let's check out today's highlight. This episode brought to you by The Game Machine. The Game Machine brings the ultimate video game experience right to your doorstep with the best of multiplayer gaming on both retro and advanced gaming systems. Whether for a birthday, family reunion, corporate team building, or school event, The Game Machine is a fully self-contained, climate-controlled gaming trailer with the most comfortable player experience here in Utah. The Game Machine provides an event that everyone, young or old, can enjoy. Check out The Game Machine online at the-game-machine.com or call at 801-432-0102. So I was sitting in a meeting the other day where some tensions were increasing and there were definitely an array of emotions in the room. Now, although I was very aware of the vibe in the room, it was my body language I seemed to be stumbling over more than anything. I caught myself comfortably sitting with my arms crossed and suddenly was concerned that the crossed arms would come across as closed off or not open to what others were saying. So I was so in my own mind over this. So then I straightened up a little bit and leaned forward to show that, intentional show of interest type thing. But then my back was like spazzing. So I tried leaning back to gain a bit of relief, to which then my hips started hurting from a previous hip surgery. So I'm sitting there shifting my weight all over one side to the other to try to bring about relief. And let's just say I felt I was failing on every account. Now, this might be a good time for myself to listen to a previous podcast episode regarding feeling inferior when I shared that people are not thinking most of what we think that they are thinking about us. But nonetheless, it made for a very awkward meeting all around, or at least I felt it was. So to help us out on situations such as these, we have Dr. Donna Van Natten joining us today to discuss all things body language. Dr. Donna research is in the science driving nonverbal communication, that facial expressions and gestures and behavioral intentions, they've changed the way that companies develop their people. So coupled with her dynamic personality and animated delivery, the body language doctor is a national spokesperson and expert in interpreting numerous components of our communication. Dr. Donna synthesizes her education and knowledge and expertise into high-octane, interactive, educational, and fun body language and communication programs. Her nonverbal communication sessions provide new insights and tools about human behaviors and cross a myriad of audiences, including corporate teams and community-based organizations and company-wide events. You name it, she can do it. She holds multiple degrees, culminating with a doctorate in educational leadership. Dr. Donna was awarded a Japan Fulbright Scholarship, is published in the Journal of Leadership Education. She wrote Image Scrimmage about the power of body language and leadership, the body language of politics about deciding who is lying and who is sincere and how you'll vote, and Body Language for Women, which is all about conveying confidence, understanding our significant others, and increasing our influence. She's been featured multiple times in Inc.com magazine for her expertise in those nonverbal communication and leadership. And she's also the founder, president, and CEO of Accountability Measures and a savvy business owner who understands the spoken and unspoken word driving all communication. Dr. Donna serves as the chair of the Chattanooga Chamber of Commerce's Small Business Awards, the YMCA Board of Directors, and is on the Better Business Bureau Board of Directors. So welcome, Dr. Donna. We are so pleased to have you today.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here with you.
Now, we're eager to learn some tools and resources to help us with those unconscious statements we're making with our body. So to start, what tends to be some of the most common nonverbal cues of women and men in general?
Great question. In our society, we're an eye contact culture. So, immediately when we enter a room, we scan the room, we make eye contact with people, or we can even avert our eyes and then, decide what to do from that point, for how long we want to gaze at somebody or just even take in the whole situation of the room. And both genders do this. I do love gender dynamics and eye contact does apply to both. And it can be used in, a host of different situations, from work to being submissive, to being superior, to romantic. And so what we do with these these eyes and eyebrows and our scleras are very fascinating. And then I think another thing is how we control our hands. We don't, a lot of times we don't think about, what do I do with my hands? Do I clasp them? Do I put them behind my back? Are they down at the side? Are my fists clenched because I'm stressed? So watch what we do with our hands. And, back in the day when we shook hands, that was a big, tell in the sense of like confidence or even, perceived confidence. But the first time we put our hands on a stranger, and, if you remember back in the day, it's how you got the tractor loan by, that good handshake.
Right.
So, so I think things like that are pretty common that people would know about, along with, you hear people, like you mentioned, crossing their arms. Am I showing defensiveness, or am I just comfortable like this, or am I cold? So it's, it's being intentional with what you do with all parts of your body, from your hair all the way down to your shoes.
Right. And as you mentioned, now with COVID, we have those masks on. And so you're right. There's even more of a draw to what our eyes are saying. And as you mentioned, the eyebrows and of course the hands. Now, as we are re-entering the workplace for many, what can help set us apart from other candidates in our body language when interviewing for a new job, or perhaps some do's and don'ts?
I think one of the big do's is remember that, cameras are everywhere. And so even before you enter the lobby, if it is in person, what are you doing in the parking lot? Are you adjusting, your clothing? What is your clothing of choice? That's very important, all the way down to your shoes. And, right along how you smell. How do you treat the administrative person that you're going to be greeted by? A lot of times we're fairly dismissive of that person getting ready to, I want to talk to the person who's doing the interview, where that is the interview.
Right.
Is before you even went through the back door, that is the interview of how kind you were and how polite you were. So I think that's important. And of course, what you choose to put on your body, how much skin do you want to show? Because we are visual, so we do, and skin is a living organ, the largest one on the body. And so what do you want to highlight, or how much makeup are you wearing, or what color is your hair? And, we make judgments all the time, and we have bias and we have prejudices, and we work hard to overcome these, but sometimes we notice something and we we draw a quick conclusion that if we're going to fight a stereotype, or if it's going to fit into our construct of like, oh, I like that, or oh, he's like me, kind of thing. So I think you have to understand, as you go into the workplace that you want to be in, you need to investigate the workplace. Are they conservative? And you dress very casually. I saw a lot of times I say, look at the building, it'll tell you a lot about what you should look like. And, the language that you use, that even though that's a verbal part, all of the ums and the tone of voice is a big part, of how loud you are, or soft, or a lisp that you might have, or how you pronounce words. Those are all considered part of communication. So being intentional with what you have control over goes a long way. A little too much perfume, or, overbearing, if you will.
Great points. Now, I'm sure all of that still applies for those who are already employed and working there, but what are some ways to win in the workplace when we already have the job?
Well, a lot of times if you look to your leadership about their nonverbals, or even the language that they use, what their office or cubicle may look like, how they groom themselves, what their nonverbals are, are they, what's their distance, the study of proxemics, are they kind of in your space or a little bit out, are they still bumping elbows, in the pandemic, with an eagerness to get close to you? So it's things like that. Of course, it always matters. That's why you hopefully don't, run into your workplace on the weekend when nobody's there, and, and you're wearing your pajamas and you're like, oh my gosh, there were cameras. Somebody saw me, kind of thing. So, and I think during the pandemic, and as you mentioned with the masks and working from home, we've become very comfortable being comfortable. But, I've done a lot of seminars on nonverbal communication and how do I handle working from home, and haven't we learned a lot about being in people's kitchens,
so
or bedrooms,
so
or
true,
living rooms, or their pets, their choice of decorator styles, that we then would go, oh my gosh, they have a gorgeous home, or oh my gosh, look at that counter, it's completely cluttered. So the nonverbals don't stop just because it was online, or this is what my desk at my workplace looks like.
Very, very true. Now, you mentioned those leadership styles. How can we use our body language within our leadership styles?
I think that naturally comes out. Leaders tend to have a presence, the way they carry themselves. Like your female role model said in childhood, stand straight, shoulders back. There's a lot to that. The studies, whether we like it or not, reward height and they reward confidence through promotions, through money. And so by standing straight is shows that I'm here, I'm present, and making eye contact and displaying your hands. We like to see open hands. If you remember, like the first thing, like when somebody, you want to see what their hands are. They, rammed in their pockets, or are they hidden away safely, or are they mirroring what the spoken word is saying? For example, if I'm standing up, or if I want you to stand up, are my hand gestures also rising? You can have a whole conversation with somebody by just using signs, or sign language from your hands, and by controlling your message. And the rule of thumb is, we will watch and believe the body more so than we will the verbal word. So if the two don't match, we would default it to, your body's telling me something different.
Of course. Now, how does that body language impact our influence? And how can we go about perhaps increasing that influence to those around us?
I think the best word to say for that is being intentional. And, the way I sit, cross my legs, my gait, am I a fast walker, or because we like that feeling of health, do I drag along, if you will. And so if you want to be influential, you have to be willing to make eye contact. And a smile is probably the most universal nonverbal. We have cultural-based nonverbals in the sense of like what means something in our country may not mean something in another country. However, a smile is extremely universal. So that takes us to, do I show my teeth? What's the condition of my mouth? And that takes us to, what's my breath smell like? Are my teeth straight or are they colored? We know, are teeth missing? And, we're extremely trying to figure things out. And we all know dental work's outrageous. So if people that have beautiful teeth have probably spent a lot of money on them. So we are going, oh, wow, they invested in their mouth. So they're investing in themselves. And so you may not be able to afford that, but, Crest white strips can go a long way if you can't afford to have your teeth straightened. And I think a lot of people are very self-conscious if they're not comfortable with what their smile looks like. I've even often seen the hand will go across the mouth to cover it, and it may look like it's embarrassing, but I quickly figure out that somebody's uncomfortable with their smile. And, that might be something that you want to focus on if that's an area of concern for you.
Of course. Now, you mentioned what could be some social situations and that just make for an awkward moment. But how about let's transition to a little bit more personal of like on dates. Any pointers for navigating those awkward social situations?
Oh, one of my favorite subjects, right? Out of the workplace as well. Oh, absolutely. When you get to some gender dynamics or even, same gender dynamics in the dating world, we really tell each other what we think of each other with our bodies. And, the pelvis or the hip structure, the cradle of life, if you will, if we're interested in something, we will shift in, we'll lean on the other leg. If people are sitting on a couch together and somebody's interested, they will actually cross their legs over pointing towards the person, like, look at my legs kind of thing. And versus if they're not, they'll actually, if like, for example, if a female is sitting on a sofa and she's flanked by two males, you can figure out which one has captivated her interest by the direction of her legs. And she may be pointed to one, and then suddenly the other one says something that she finds, amusing or interesting, and she'll actually subtly shift her body and legs and turn the other way. The other thing that we might notice is there'll be some hair play, curling around the hair, playing with the ends of the hair. And, our hair is like in animal world. It's our mane, if you will, like, notice me, I have beautiful hair kind of thing. And,
right.
And men are the same way. Nobody's getting off the hook here. You'll see a wider stance to show, health and, fertility of like, I'm very healthy. Look at how strong and big I can be. Which, so in the dating world, there's a lot of that going on, and you don't have to say a word. At the same token, if we see something that's awkward or uncomfortable, you'll see people separate from each other, back up a little bit more, put something in between them like a table or a chair, your handbag, a backpack, even you'll put your hands in front of your body if somebody is not, to your liking, to say like, hey, there's a physical barrier between us.
Interesting. Now, I caught it on two different things there in the work as well as in that personal like dating. And that was just, it seems to be that confidence that you bring to the table. How can we not only convey confidence? You mentioned standing up straight, shoulders back, so forth. And of course, the different work that might need to be done. But truly, how can we feel and be more confident just walking in to a room or just being in a room simply by our body language?
Well, the rule is that I'm smiling before I walk into the room. I'm smiling before I actually answer the phone, because there's nothing like a smiling person to diffuse any situation. You don't pose threat. You look engaged. You feel good, and you're about yourself, and you're smiling. And where do you walk? Like you're saying, shoulders back. But how fast am I walking? Do I stop and scan the room? Do I immediately become a wallflower by hitting the wall and kind of hitting the perimeter of don't notice me? Do I walk over to a group I may or may not know and introduce myself, or back in the day with handshakes, put that out or put the elbow out. So there are definitely ways to convey confidence. One of the things, if you're sitting at a table and people are coming in, there's a nonverbal gesture called steepling. And it's literally taking your hands and putting together almost in a prayer pose, but separate the fingers like a steeple. Now, don't do the thing where, you open the door and there's all people.
Yeah.
But steepling is a confident. Men tend to steeple higher, physically higher at the table than women do. But by doing a steepling nonverbal, it's telling others, hey, I'm feeling pretty good here. I know I belong at the table, if you will. So we tend to see that for confidence while sitting. And like I said, while standing, you will see the hands. You don't want to twist the feet. You want them to be planted on the ground, like planted mind, planted thoughts, planted feet kind of thing.
Okay.
So how are you handling your body? Not curling into yourself. But at the same time, your stance is not so wide as a female that you're like, okay, probably not the place to be looking like Wonder Woman, with a cape flying behind you. So it's understanding how your body works for you, whatever, height you are or size you are, and who you're engaging with. If you're tall, like I'm very tall, I don't always need to appear taller to captivate the room. I tend to wear heels, so it's going to naturally happen, but I don't have to, quote, make myself bigger. I don't have to hands-on hips, looking very large or standing a little bit wider, because I am. So that might be something that a smaller stature person might want to do. Or if I want to give away the perceived power to somebody else, I open hands and I often, give it to them lean in a little bit more and make sure that they're being heard, and then I don't have to be the center of attention.
That makes sense. Now, in your book, The Body Language of Politics, you talk about tips on deciding who's lying. So kind of a different look that we're going for in what we're conveying in trying to understand other people. How can we fine tune our gut instincts to confirm the truth or deception of what others are saying in our overall day-to-day lives?
I always get asked this one. This is a great one, and lying is something that we learn in childhood. It's actually a survival skill, and we need to have it. Now, no one wants a sociopathic, chronic, pathological liar, but little white lies, go a long way when needed, of how's that look on you? Looks great. How's my hair look? All right, yeah, really flattering with your face. You may not agree, but that's a little bit different than true deception. And we like to, the old school thinking was, if you're looking right, you're lying, or if you're looking left, you're telling the truth. To be honest with you, a good liar will look right at you and lie to the hill. And so you can't always, judge it on the eye, but the things you can notice that would be a little more subtle would be like blink rates. We all have a comfortable blink rate. And, people study like how many blinks per minute. And when there's a cognitive load on the brain, when there's going to be deception, there's a lot to think about for the liar. And so the blinking might become more of a stare, or the blinking might increase as the liar, if you will, is trying to figure out how to manipulate the situation. We also might hear a bit of a cough, like, clearing of the throat that was no longer, wasn't there when they started. And I always say, you're trying to, hold that lie down, if you will. We also might see that the hands, where do the hands go? Are they covering the mouth? Are they covering the eye? Are they playing with the ear in the sense of, I don't want to say it, I don't want to hear it? These chemicals called catecholamines are these irritants that our body puts out, and they can irritate the nose when there's times of deception, and that's why the hands may go to the nose, and that's actually called the Pinocchio effect. So, poor Pinocchio gets the label of being every time he lied, his nose grew. So, there's a lot of ways. It's not going to be the way that you always think it is. If there's a hesitancy, I always say, like, don't be talking to your plus one and then, he or she coughs and you're like, liar. You want to look for things in clusters of 3, just because there might be one, of like, okay, their blink rate changed. You want to then notice, is there some skin blanching, or a flushing of the skin? Are the hands now doing something else? Is there something coming to the lip, like, that was no longer there? Because we usually don't touch our faces unless there's an emotional or behavioral change, that takes us to that. And so you want to begin to look for these changes in somebody that you think might be deceptive.
I think that is fascinating. I also love hearing that it comes in 3s, because I'm thinking, oh man, for those of us with allergies, we are doomed at how many times we might touch our nose. So
exactly.
Look for them in 3.
Right. And when it comes to something like that, because we do look for a beautiful white sclera, or the white of the eye, and there are a lot of allergies, and you have to tell your person that you're communicating with if you have a non-white sclera, bloodshot, because we'll default it to bad things like hungover, tired, drugs, and you might say allergies. So, and you give that little squeeze of the pretend bottle, like eye drops, that great little nonverbal saying, like, my eyes are itching, so I need the little eye drops. Mm-hmm. So by telling that really helps people. It's kind of like how our eyebrows and our sclera, because we associate a white sclera with being healthy. And so if we see a yellow one, which really could be a diseased eye or a diseased body, we're like, why isn't it really white? So being aware of that stuff. And for you, telling, your person, oh, my eyes are killing me with allergy season, will grant you a lot of grace.
Right. That verbal communication along with the nonverbal, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Now, any other pointers to help us gain a greater understanding of what's really going on when we communicate with others?
Well, remember that everybody has baselines. Like you mentioned when we first started talking, you may cross your arms and you just may be very comfortable with that as a resting. But take a little bit of time and watch somebody's, baseline nonverbals, how they're sitting, how their legs are, what's on their body. And it could be even, from the jewelry they're wearing to the, the smells around them, to makeup choices or hair choices, and watch that over time as what's their baseline. And then if you see something deviating from that, that's when you begin to go, oh, something else is going on here that's not necessarily being verbalized.
Right.
Because, we want to, now that's not to say that the spoken word isn't important. It is. But if you look at, the research of Moravian on the 7-38-55 rule, 7% being verbal, 38% being a tone of voice, and then 55% being our bodies. Verbal, it has merit, don't get me wrong, but it's not our primary way that we have to communicate. So, the use of a is very telling when how are things of, oh, they're fine, just that pitch change. And so I always suggest that people, it's hard, like, where do I start? And pick up a couple of your tone of voice, of how fast do you talk, or what's your latency or the space time between your talking and somebody else's talking. Do you run over each other, or is there a lot of space in there, that latency time? And you want to match whoever you're speaking with. It's very polite and considerate when you figure out how loud somebody is, or how quickly they respond, and then how quickly you respond. things like that. When you think about the 9 elements of tone of voice, some are in your control, and some are not in your control, and we've all done this, whether we like it or not. You're arguing with somebody, or you're +1, and then your voice gets elevated, like everything is just fine. Yeah. You know where I'm going with this. You're
yes.
Like, I'm hearing a pitch that sounds like things are far from fine. But that's what I would say. And, you do take that into the workplace when somebody upsets you or something upsets you. And, it all rolls into each other. So I think a lot of self-awareness, of like, oh, I tend to do that. Or, yeah, I've been told I do that. And consider being intentional and working on that.
That's great. Now, Dr. Donna, we have a signature question here I'd love to hear your feedback on. And that is, if you could go back and encourage, inspire, or equip yourself as a child, what would you tell your young self?
Well, it's so funny. When I was younger, and this is probably like, what am I going to do when I grow up kind of thing. And I love what I do. I think I was a natural born teacher. 30 years ago, I taught what we call junior high or middle school. But I remember my father talking to me about becoming a pilot or becoming an attorney. And I was so dismissive of those things, though he could see it in me. And so continue to be open to those things. Of course, I didn't have a problem really talking or asking questions. According to my family, my first word was why. I still do ask 1,000 questions. And so I think that, for my young self, I think I probably would have pursued those avenues more than I did. I was like, I don't know about that. Just ready to go to school.
Now, you have a third book, Body Language for Women, that just came out. How can our listeners go about getting that book? I want to make sure that we make that accessible for them.
Oh, thank you. And, it's actually my favorite of the 3 in the sense of it really goes back and it talks about relationships, romantic relationships. There's a lot of self-esteem that's in there of where do these female behaviors come from? Where do they start? There's some really rich data in that. And it brings in women of different ethnicities and time and place of, what was the 50s versus now. I just really enjoyed that book so much. So thank you for mentioning it. And it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and, Simon & Schuster's the distributor. So it's, everywhere, fortunately. And then, you can go through my website, bodylanguagedoctor.com, dr.com, but it's going to drive you right to, who doesn't use the Amazon or Barnes & Noble kind of thing. And so it's a light blue cover. You might see one of the yellow cover. The publisher started in yellow and then they switched to light blue. But type in Body Language for Women with my name and it'll pop up. And I would appreciate that. And a kind review would be appreciated as we push each other along to promote all the work of helping each other.
Absolutely. Now, how can our listeners connect with you?
Now, going through my website, bodylanguagedoctor.com, contact me link on there, and I would love to hear from you.
Okay.
Because as you mentioned when we got started here, I do go into businesses, I do keynote, I could be your lunchtime speaker at your event or a dinner or a closer or an opener. I think the subject of body language is people understand it and they get excited about it. Teach me something, read me, do something. And I'd love to do that. So
perfect. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes also. Well, Dr. Donna, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. This has been so enlightening and just what to look for as well as what we can work on in ourselves as well. So thank you again. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you for reaching out. And I look forward to hear some great feedback.
Thank you for joining me on this journey of life. I hope that today's highlight has been encouraging, inspiring, and equipping so you can go out and live your life full of purpose. I'd be honored if you'd take a moment to leave a review, or better yet, subscribe. We can also stay in touch by joining my email list at hollycurby.com. That's HOLLYCURBY.com. Until next time, make it a great day for a great day.